All right, the nervous system today. So that means we only have one more system to go. That's going to be the special senses. So senses with an actual organ, not just the general senses. So the nervous system is highly complex. I'll try to demystify that for you guys. There's a lot of different divisions as well, and I'll try to keep you guys in line on where we are. All right, the first division. So we have the central nervous system, and it's divided into two parts. So the easier of the two is the central nervous system. It only has two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord will both interpret data, and they're able to send a signal out. That means everything else is going to be in the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is then further divided still. So remember the CNS first, and then the first branch of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system. So anytime you hear the word soma, think of going to the body. So you can control the body, the skeletal muscle. And then the other division is the autonomic nervous system. So this system is going to go without your conscious thought. So a lot of times it'll refer to the organs, the smooth muscles, which you don't control. Direction. Direction of information. So sensory is information that goes to the brain. So all your peripheral nerves will send information up the spinal cord to the brain. And if it's a signal going away from the brain, then that's going to be the efferent. So the thing at the end, it could be a muscle, it could be a gland, it could be an organ, that's called the effexor. Right? So you got to follow these terms. So afferent, going to the brain, any signal to the brain. Efferent, any signal going away. And the thing that's being affected is the effexor. Interneurons, those are going to be nerve cells that can interpret data. So we have these in our brain and also in the spinal cord. And we'll talk about those interneurons during reflexes. Multiple functions. So the main function is keeping the body alive and maintaining balance. So we got neurons, the things that they activate, they send a signal to, telling a muscle to contract, that's an effexor, or telling a gland to release its secretion, that would also be the effexor. Nerve cells can't divide, so when you're young, up to about age 5, your brain is rapidly growing and dividing. But after that, the neurons don't divide much. So the science is showing that they might be able to coax the nerve cell into dividing. But the cells that can divide are the helper cells, the neuroglia. So most cancers, most brain cancers are of the neuroglia cells or cancers that have metastasized that started from other areas of the body. Astrocytes. What's an astro? What's astrology? So stars, right? So these are star-shaped cells that provide and support blood vessels. Microglia, these guys are phagocytic cells. So they're big eaters, small eaters in this case. So any debris, any thing that shouldn't be there, they'll eliminate. They'll just digest them. And then the oligodendrites. So oligo is fat. So insulating your neurons, because they send an electrical signal, just like electrical wires, you have insulation around the metal. The neurons in your brain also need insulation, and that's done by these cells in the central nervous system. The cell body. That is where the nucleus is. So all the DNA. So here is the cell body and the nucleus. I'm sorry, the nucleus is circled. Organelles, just like any cell, but here there's going to be a lot of energy producing cells. So we have to produce a lot of ATP energy for the brain to function. So fibers extend. So the fibers extend from the cell body are the dendrites, and then its long tail is called the axon. So the nerve will fire down along its axon. So here we have all the dendrites branching out, making connections. And once the electricity is built up, the neuron will fire down its axon tail and then release neurotransmitters. So these chemicals will be picked up by the next neuron at the synapses gap, and then that signal will be propagated. So your memories are the pathways of these electrical signals, electrical and chemical signals. So you can grow dendrites, you can continue to grow these branching ends to make contact with other neurons. So let me draw this. So the next cell might be here, and then its dendrites will detect these neurotransmitters, create an electrical impulse, and then it'll release its neurotransmitters. So when you repeat steps, when you recite something you need to memorize, a list over and over and over, that's reinforcing those connections in your brain, and that makes a memory. So that's why repetition works for memory. Swan cells. So in the peripheral nervous system, you have swan cells that create the insulation. So they wrap myelin sheathing around the axon. That way the electrical impulse doesn't dissipate and get lost. That signal doesn't get lost. So the fatty matter is white in color. So anywhere you see myelin sheathing, that's called white matter. And if it's not myelin sheathing, that's going to be called gray matter. So this is where all the cell bodies are. They're going to look dark. Whereas all of the axons are wrapped in the fat, they're going to have a white color. So in your brain, the gray matter is structured on the outside, the white matter on the inside. Polarization, so nerve impulse. So how do we create electricity in the body? Electrolytes, right? You guys recall from chemistry, potassium ion and sodium ion have a positive charge. And within the cell, what do we pump on the inside? We pump tons and tons of potassium on the inside, and we pump sodium to the outside. So imagine this is the axon tail, and it creates a tube. So here at the end, you'll have the terminal end, and it'll release its neurotransmitter. So what you have is polarization. You got a lot of potassium on the inside, so all those purple round balls are potassium, and then a lot of sodium on the outside. all the orange balls. When the nerve fires, what happens is the membrane opens its floodgates. So because of the high concentration of sodium on the outside, they're going to rush in. And because of the high concentration of potassium on the inside, the potassium is going to rush out of the cell. So this electrical impulse will propagate down the cell membrane to the terminal end of the neuron. So here is that electricity being built up at the dendrites, at the cell body. Once you hit the threshold, the cell fires, and then it has to go back to its polarized state. So you guys remember the EKG, electrocardiogram? So that's what the electrical cardiogram is measuring, the electrical impulse, the firing of the heart. The synapses knob. So when one neuron releases its neurotransmitter, it's going to be detected by the next, right? So this gap right here is what's being depicted right there in the synapses gap. And how they release the chemicals is via the vesicles. So these vesicles contain your neurotransmitter, let's say serotonin. So here the signal is MDMA, right? That causes the release of serotonin. So that's the neurotransmitter. So when you take ecstasy, your brain cells will detect it, releasing the serotonin. So once it's there, the serotonin will then be broken down because you already got the signal. So the example used was serotonin as the neurotransmitter. So that builds up the electrical charge on the next neuron, and then it fires. So that pathway is what leads to your memory. We'll talk about how this is disrupted in disease states. All right, the hole at the bottom of your skull is called the foramen magnum. And then there's a couple spaces where it gets a little bigger. When it branches and kind of merges together, those are called plexus. Blood-brain barrier. So this is just a collection of cells. It's not a physical barrier. And it protects what goes in and out of the brain. When you're a baby, it's very immature, so the brain is very sensitive to chemicals. As you get older, it's more developed. You guys ever heard of meningitis? Yeah. So covering your brain and your spinal cord, so the entire central nervous system, are 3 tissue-like layers. Those are called the meninges. So if you get an infection, that's meningitis, inflammation of the meninges. It has 3 layers, 3 physical layers you can dissect away. Unlike the blood-brain barrier, there's really nothing there to dissect. So the first layer is the dura mater. So dura means it's very durable, so it's the tough layer. The second layer is the arachnoid matter. An arachnoid is spider, so it kind of looks like a spider web. And the inner layer is the pia mater. So you got 3 layers: epi, arachnoid, and pia. So epidural is given above the dura mater. And if you need to do a spinal tap, right, that goes through the first 2 layers. And where you want to go is into the subarachnoid space, CSF. This is where you'll have the cerebral spinal fluid. So if you suspect a problem in someone's brain, instead of drilling a hole in their brain and getting some of this fluid out, you can get it from their spine. It's one contiguous space, and the fluid is shared between your spine and your brain. So that's going to be called not an epidural, what that would be called an intrathecal. All right, which pathway goes from the brain? Afferent or efferent? Going to the brain is going to be afferent. Going from the brain, efferent. So the thing being affected is the effexor. All right, so this is nerves, nerve count. Do you guys recall the bone count? How many bones in your neck? How many bones? How many ribs do you have? 12 thoracic. How many lumbar? How many sacral? And the coccyx was 3 to 5 fused, right? So if you recall the bone numbers, then all you have to do is adjust this one. Just add 1 to the neck, and then you're done. So remember, the bones first, then the muscles, then the nerves, because they relate all the names based on the bone names. Gray matter, white matter. So in the brain, it's kind of opposite. So here we got gray matter on the inside of the spinal cord. That means all the axons, all the tails of the neurons are on the outside. So it's going to be dark. So here's the dorsal side, and this is the ventral side. So this is the front side, this is the back side. So information going to the brain, the afferent pathway is the dorsal route. Information coming down from the brain and out is going to be the ventral route, the efferent pathway. So they merge at the end. Right? So the dorsal route, afferent, ventral route, efferent. So here they're just saying it's kind of opposite. Here we got the cell bodies on the inside, and then the axons that are myelinated on the outside. It's exactly opposite in the brain. Ascending, descending. So sensory, afferent, motor, efferent. All right, reflexes. So the brain interprets data, but the spinal cord also interprets data in its interneurons. So when the doctor have you cross your legs and then he hits you with the hammer, the reflex hammer, he's testing not your brain function, but your spinal cord function. Because we have special neurons called interneurons, so it does not need to go to the brain. It sends an immediate reaction and to the muscles of your knee, the muscles of your quad to flex, and then your knee jerks. So the brain is not involved in a reflex. Also, when they have you cross your arms and they hit you on the elbow with the reflex hammer, they're also testing for your spinal cord function. All right, let's get to the brain. So since the spinal cord does interpret data, that's why it's included in the central nervous system. The largest part of your brain, the cerebrum. The diencephalon has 2 parts. Do you guys know which 2 parts they are? No? So think about it. We'll get to it in a couple slides. The brain stem has 3 parts, and that's your basic bodily functions keeping you alive. And then how do you spell small? 2 L's, right? So the cerebellum is your small brain. So just remember that, because it kind of looks like this guy. Cerebrum is here. The cerebellum is back in the back of your head. Cerebrum, 2 hemispheres, left and right. So everything on the left side is controlled by the right hemisphere. Everything on the right side of your body is controlled by the left hemisphere. So the information, the wires got crossed. Connecting the left and right hemisphere is the corpus callosum. So we'll go to the diagram, and you'll see it's like a different white structure that connects the two hemispheres. A sulci is when you have bumps on the brain because it's folding. Anytime you have a little dip or a valley in the brain, that's going to be a sulci. And if you have a bump, that's going to be a gyri. So a gyrus is singular, sulcus is singular, gyri, sulci, that's plural. And then splitting the two hemisphere is the fissure right down the center. So that's the longitudinal fissure. So indicated in the fuchsia color is your frontal lobe. So where's your frontal brain or your frontal bone? And then also your frontalis muscle. Your parietal lobe, so it's that larger lobe here. Your temporal lobe, just name where the bone is, here in blue. And then for the cerebellum, how do you spell small? Just remember there are two L's in the cerebellum. It's down here. And it has a weird structure. And then where vision is processed, that's in the back of your brain, the occipital lobe. All right, cortex versus medulla. Cortex just means the outer surface of the brain. So here in the cerebellum, the outer portion, that's the cortex. So this is where all of the cell bodies are. And then all of the axons, which are myelinated, stretch into the brain. And that's where all the white matter is. Ventricles. Where are there ventricles in the body? The heart, right? So when they first dissect the body, they dissect it on, of course, dead bodies, and all the blood has drained out of the body. So when they cut through the heart, it was an empty chamber. So they called it ventricle. So ventricle actually means empty chamber. So in your brain, you have these cavities, and it extends all the way down to your spine. And that's where we can do that spinal tap. If you want to know what's going on in your brain, we can collect spinal fluid, cerebral spinal fluid. All right, here's the answer to the diencephalon. The thalamus and below it, hypo means below, hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is the bridge between the nervous system and your pituitary. So that's going to be your endocrine system. So that's the bridge between your nerves and your hormones, is the hypothalamus. Basic bodily functions is the brainstem. So that's heat regulation, respiration, heart rate, thirst, etc. Cerebellum, where control is started in the cortex. So if you want to jump or run, that information starts here, but for that final fine-tuned movement, that's processed in the small brain. So it does different types of calculations. It can do it very quickly. Plexus. So where the nerves begin to merge, those are called plexus. So we have it in the neck, the cervical plexus. It branches in the upper arm, so the brachial plexus, and it branches in the lower back as well, lumbar and the sacral plexus. Cranial nerves versus spinal nerves. So there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Some are sensory, some are sensory and motor. Don't worry, you don't have to know the difference. You don't have to know the difference amongst them. Just know of and refer to a list. And then your spinal nerves are the 31 pairs that branch out. How many nerves in the neck? How many bones in the neck? Oh, we just went through this. All right, how many nerves in the thoracic area? How many ribs do you have? How many in the lumbar region? Sacral region, and then coccygeal is just one. All right, so that's 31 pairs of nerves. So we'll quickly go over the cranial nerves. Just recall which ones go to the eyes. So olfactory is smell. 2, optic, that goes to the eyes. Ocular motor, movement of the eyes. 3, that's a muscle in the eye that allows you to move. Trigeminal, so how many branches do you think there are? 3. Right? So one goes to the eye, one goes to the ear, one goes kind of under the tongue to the glands. Abductus, that's the muscle in the eye as well. So of the 6, 4, maybe 5 of the 6 are already to the eyes. So that's how important vision is and how much of our brain process vision. So vision is actually processed in the back in the occipital lobe. Facial nerves, vestibulocochlear, sorry. So this is for balance and hearing. So that goes to the ears. Gloss is tongue. Pharynx, that's your throat, right? So this is your tongue and throat, glossopharyngeal. Vagus nerve, this is the biggest. Vagus always mean like the most important. So this one goes to all of your organs. And for some people, that nerve is too active and it makes them hungry. So it overstimulates their appetite. So what they do is they go in and they cut the vagus nerve a little bit to reduce appetite. So everyone's all, whoo, maybe that's what's going on with me. Accessory nerve, so that goes into the neck area. And then hypo is under, gloss is tongue. So this one goes under the tongue. So don't worry about where they branch off in the skull. Just refer to the diagram if you have any of those questions. All right, how many in the neck?
8.
How many in the thoracic area? Lumbar, sacral, and the coccygeal. 1. Right, so there's your 31 nerves. How many cranial nerves? 12 pairs. We just went over. What is nerve 10 called? The most important one. Where you can snip it to suppress your appetite. The vagus nerve. Different branches. So different branches will cover different areas of the body. So if it isn't connected to that spinal nerve, then you won't feel it. So for example, if you slice the nerve that goes to your arm, then every information from your arm will be blocked. Ventral root, dorsal root. So as mentioned, information going to the brain is in the dorsal root, so this is afferent. Information coming from the brain is the ventral root, and then they merge. So the branching, the merging of the nerves are called plexuses, and everyone, even though the branching is very complex, it's pretty much the same branching for everyone. So all these nerve plexuses, they kind of form in the same way, same pathways. Somatic, where am I going to? The body or the organs? Body. And then if I'm autonomic, I'm most likely going to go to the organ. So another word is the visceral. So anytime you hear the word visceral, that means organs. Ganglia. So that's a gang of nerves. So here you have a nerve going along, right, this way. And then you'll have a bunch of a gang of nerve cells that kind of act like a checkpoint. Most of the time they just let regular information through. If it's really important, they'll magnify the signal. And if there's overriding, they'll actually block a signal. So they act like a checkpoint. So it's just a gang of nerve cells. And they regulate the effexor. So here they're just showing it diagrammatically. So you got a motor neuron goes to the neural ganglia. It's the checkpoint before it goes to the actual organ. Now for muscle, it has to be fine, exact stimulation of the correct muscle in order to make your fingers move, right? But for the organ, you just have to get the organ to go faster or slower. So in the case of blood vessels, dilate or constrict. Two branches. So we have the sympathetic nervous system. So that usually ups regulates. So increased respiration, increased heart rate, more sugar in the blood, so your muscles have energy to fight or run away. We're going to use epinephrine. So that's released by the adrenal gland, the adrenal gland. So another name for it is adrenaline. So you get that adrenaline rush. Blood vessel constricts. Blood pressure goes up. Parasympathetic is the opposite. It's going to stimulate rest and digest. So the sympathetic nervous system is like pressing on the gas. The parasympathetic nervous system is like stepping on the brake pedal. So the neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine. So these two systems will work together to create homeostasis. Neurological testing. So state of consciousness. So how awake they are, how alert can they respond to simple questions. We mentioned the reflex tests in the knee, also the elbow. Speech pattern. Are they slurring on one side of the face, paralyzed or not moving? The doctor might ask you to walk across the exam room to examine your posture or your gait. We can do that. Spinal tap, the lumbar puncture. MRI, take pictures. A lot of times it's blockage or impingement of the nerve. So it could be a disc in the spine, or in the case of carpal tunnel, the swelling caused the nerve to get pinched and you'll get pain. Positron emission tomography. So this is kind of like MRI. So they use a beam of positrons and how they reflect, they can make a picture. Angiograph. Here they're going to inject a dye, so a radioactive dye, into the bloodstream. And under microscopy, they can see where the dye goes. So they can detect blockage or stenosis. Stenosis is narrowing of any blood vessel. CT. So just like positron emission tomography, they're just putting together a picture. And then they, just like an EKG, they can place electrodes to detect the activity, electrical activity in the brain. An EEG. We'll quickly go over the olfactory or the cranial nerves. So we got 12 pairs. So here we got the olfactory nerve. So smell. 3, 4, and 6. So that's for the eyes. That's how we test the eyes. So one example is they have you follow the pen. So what are they looking for when they have you follow it? So the first thing is your pupils. Do they react to the light? So most people, when you shine a light into their eyes, their pupils get smaller. If there's impairment in the nerves, then the pupils will stay dilated. Also, when they track the pen across the eye, they're seeing if the eye darts a little bit. So that's what police officers will do when they're testing you to see if you're drunk or not. So when they hand back your license, they always hand it across your vision. So when you look at it, they're seeing if your eye bounces. And that's a sign of impairment. Could be from drugs or alcohol. Cranial nerve 5. Have them clench their teeth. See if those muscles are affected. Okay. For 8, facial expression. 12, that's under the tongue, hypoglossal. So stick out their tongue. See if that nerve is affected. Reflex A. The prefix A is without. So areflexia is there is no reflex. Hypo, too little of a reflex, so the knee didn't kick enough. If you kick the doctor, then that is hyperreflexia, too much of a reflex. When they have you cross your arm, they're testing for the biceps and the tapping in the abs as well. Injury. So you have traumatic injuries. You guys heard of TBI, traumatic brain injury? Heard of CTE that's been in the news? The brain damage from football. So it causes like Parkinson's, depression, really much mimicking um, Alzheimer's. Okay, in Alzheimer's. So what's going on is protein is replacing the myelin sheathing. So that means all of that electrical signal is being lost. So if your memories are in your pathways and now it gets stuck because it's being replaced with protein, it hardens the brain, you physically lose your memory. ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. So A is without, myo is muscle, tropic is nutrition or support, and it affects the nerves on the outside, lateral nerves. So the hardening of it pretty much kills all the nerves and you get the muscle weakness. Toxins. So from an infection, the toxins will paralyze the facial nerves. So it's usually affected one side of the face, and as long as the infection goes away and the toxin goes away, then you should have recovery. The rumor was, you guys know who Sylvester Stallone is? Yeah. From Rocky? You guys know how he talks with one side of his mouth? So they think that was damage from Bell palsy. Tumors and cancers. So as mentioned, most neurons aren't dividing, so it's usually not them that causes the cancer. It comes from a different area, metastasized from a different area, or it's one of the neuroglia cells that became cancerous. Epilepsy. So epilepsy causes seizures. So the misfiring of the brain's electrical system will cause a seizure. So when somebody has a seizure, it's uncontrollable. Sometimes it only occurs on one side. So you'll see only contraction on one side of the body or the face, or sometimes it's the whole body. when they wake up, they'll be confused and they'll be very tired because they did all the muscle contraction. A lot of people think that this is the brain's way of rebooting. So just like your computer, if you give it a shock or you shut it down, kind of resets the computer. They used to use seizure therapy, electroshock therapy, to treat mental disorders and depression. Headaches, the brain does not have any nerve or any pain receptors, I should say. So during brain surgery, the surgeon can actually poke around in a patient's brain and they won't feel anything. And they'll actually have conscious surgery because they don't want to cut the wrong parts during brain surgery. So for migraines, you can have management therapy or abortive therapy. So if you're taking drugs every day or injections once a week, then that's preventative. But if you get the onset of a migraine, like sensitivity to light and sound, then you'll take medication at that time, and hopefully it aborts it, so you never get a full-blown migraine. We mentioned meningitis, inflammation of one of the meninges, dura mater, arachnoid, or pia. MS, so here we have hardening and damaging of the nerves as well. So the myelin sheathing is destroyed. Here's nerve pain. Parkinson's. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in your reward, and it's a down regulator, right? So acetylcholine in the skeletal system is an upregulator. It's going to cause contraction. So people with Parkinson's do not make enough dopamine, and they have too much acetylcholine, so it causes those jitters and the continuous contractions. The sciatic nerve runs down your leg. It can be impinged, causing pain, or it can be damaged, causing severe pain. The signs of strokes can be subtle. For some people, they just feel a little bit tired, but that might be a sign of a stroke or a heart attack, especially in women. Signs of stroke and heart attack are more subtle. But if you start to get blurry vision, paralysis on one side of the body or another, they say if you smell toast, burnt toast, then that's a sign of getting a stroke as well. All right, so that ends the nervous system. Tomorrow we'll cover the special senses. But right now, I'll break you guys, but when you come back, work on online learning initiative modules 53 and 54.